Martin Mac McAllister and Darren Daz Hughes weren't just two street kids from Liverpool. They were the architects of a secret empire that stretched from grim back alleys to the bustling ports of South America. Their rise from local dealers to international kingpins would change the city forever, exposing a hidden world where loyalty is bought with blood and power comes at a deadly price. In the 1980s, Liverpool was a city caught in freefall. Once a proud shipping hub, its docks were closing, factories were shutting down, and entire communities were left without work. The economic collapse hit hard, especially in areas like Toxteth, Kirkdale, and Norris Green, where unemployment became generational and opportunity all but disappeared. In the absence of jobs and hope, crime filled the vacuum. Young lads, some barely in their teens, started off stealing car radios, shoplifting, and running errands for older criminals. The police were stretched thin, overwhelmed by a surge in petty thefts, robberies and house burglaries. What looked like random small-time crime was, in truth, the beginning of something far more dangerous. Heroin swept into the city like a storm. It arrived through the same ports that once brought in goods from around the world. Now, those same shipping lanes were used to smuggle misery. Addicts piled up in back alleys, and entire families were torn apart by the drug's grip. Local lads who once nicked bikes started dealing raps on corners. The money came fast, and the rules of the game shifted. Older crooks who used to pull bank jobs or rob warehouses suddenly found themselves replaced by teenage dealers, armed with burner phones and kitchen knives. It wasn't about planning anymore. It was about power, fear, and quick cash. What made Liverpool different was its isolation. Cut off from London's traditional crime families, the city developed its own way of doing things. Gangs weren't run like mafia clans with suits and formal meetings. They were built in tower blocks, schoolyards, and prison wings. Trust was earned through loyalty and violence, not bloodlines. Crews had names, symbols, and territories. Some sold weed, others handled heroin. But all of them understood one rule: money meant survival. The more you had, the less likely you were to end up dead or inside. By the end of the decade, certain names were starting to echo in police files, crews that operated with surprising coordination. While many still saw them as kids on bikes, those watching closely knew better. Liverpool's underworld wasn't forming. It had already arrived, quietly, ruthlessly, and with no intention of slowing down. In the early 1990s, one group began to rise above the rest. Based in the tough, working-class streets of the Dingle area in South Liverpool, they came to be known as the Deli Mob. They didn't choose the name, it was given to them by the media after a string of violent incidents linked to the group, but they wore it like a badge of honor. Unlike the scattered street gangs of the previous decade, the Deli Mob operated with a clear structure. At the top were a few key figures who managed the money and sourced the drugs. Beneath them, layers of trusted lieutenants ran smaller teams who handled the street-level business. It was a hierarchy built on respect, fear, and absolute control. The Deli Mob's bread and butter was heroin, which remained in high demand across the city. They controlled the supply in South Liverpool, using abandoned houses as stash spots and young runners to deliver to addicts across the area. Kids as young as 12 were given phones, packages, and instructions. No questions asked. The police were often 2 steps behind. The mob constantly rotated phones, switched cars, and changed their dealing spots daily. Their movements were hard to trace, and even harder to stop. They never flaunted their wealth openly, but those in the know could see the signs: designer trainers, holidays abroad, and expensive watches on the wrists of men who had never had a real job. Violence was a key part of their rise. Rivals were dealt with harshly. Houses were firebombed, dealers beaten in public, and anyone suspected of talking to police was made an example of. But the Deli Mob didn't just rely on muscle, they were strategic. They formed loose alliances with other gangs across the northwest, trading product and territory when it made sense. This allowed them to expand into places like Manchester and Glasgow without major bloodshed. They even began experimenting with larger shipments, moving heroin and cannabis by road in hidden compartments. By the mid-90s, the Deli Mob had become one of the most feared and respected groups in the city. While some crews crumbled under pressure or tore themselves apart from within, the Deli Mob grew stronger, organized, ruthless, and always looking for the next move. While the Deli Mob carved out its reputation through violence and local dominance, another force was quietly taking shape in North Liverpool. Unlike their counterparts in the south, this group moved in silence, keeping a low profile and avoiding unnecessary attention. They didn't flash cash in public or chase headlines. Their aim was different, bigger, more calculated. Over time, law enforcement and journalists began referring to them as the Scouse Cartel, though no official name was ever confirmed. This wasn't a traditional gang with colors or territory, it was a network, a carefully built operation that focused on distribution, logistics, and profit. The cartel's roots were in areas like Walton, Enfield, and Norris Green. But their influence reached far beyond local postcodes. Instead of fighting for street corners, they focused on controlling supply chains. They didn't just deal drugs, they moved them, stored them, and laundered the profits with frightening efficiency. Their operations were clean, professional, and often invisible to the untrained eye. They used legitimate-looking businesses as fronts, car washes, haulage firms. Even import-export companies registered under false names. While the police were chasing street dealers, the cartel was orchestrating multi-million-pound shipments from quiet back office. One of their key advantages was access to the port. Liverpool's docks had long been a gateway to the world, and the cartel made full use of them. Containers arriving from South America, West Africa, and mainland Europe were sometimes packed with more than just produce. By using forged documents and corrupt insiders, they could slip shipments through undetected. Some containers were never even searched. When they were, the drugs were often hidden inside industrial machinery, sealed crates or chemical drums, anything that gave them time to move the product before authorities caught up. Instead of turf wars, the Scouse Cartel preferred partnerships. They formed quiet relationships with other gangs across the UK, supplying wholesale product in exchange for loyalty and silence. This network extended into Scotland, Ireland, and eventually into mainland Europe. They built something bigger than a gang. They built a supply empire. By the early 2000s, it was clear that the cartel wasn't interested in local dominance. They were thinking globally, operating like a business, and staying steps ahead of both rivals and law enforcement. While others played the short game, the cartel was already plotting the future. In the early 2000s, the drug trade in Liverpool took a dramatic turn. The city's criminal networks, especially the Scouse Cartel, began shifting their focus beyond the UK. For years, local gangs had relied on middlemen based in London or Manchester to source drugs from abroad, but now, they were cutting out the middle. Instead of waiting for product to arrive, they went looking for it themselves, and Europe welcomed them with open arms. The Netherlands became the first major hub. Amsterdam and Rotterdam, known for their liberal drug policies and sprawling port systems, offered the perfect environment for illicit business. Liverpool gang members began flying in under the radar, posing as tourists or businessmen. They built relationships with Dutch traffickers, Moroccan hash suppliers, and Balkan enforcers. Nightclubs, coffee shops, and brothels became meeting points for high-level deals. Before long, Scouse crews were negotiating directly with major importers, buying drugs in bulk at discounted rates and smuggling them back into the UK using creative methods. Antwerp and Brussels followed next. These cities, with their porous borders and vast road networks, were ideal for moving product across Europe. Scousers rented apartments, opened front businesses, and began recruiting locals to act as drivers and couriers. The operations became increasingly sophisticated. Some used specially modified vehicles with hidden compartments. Others disguised shipments as food deliveries or construction materials. In many cases, police never even knew drugs had passed through their checkpoints. Back home, the structure of the cartel changed. Crews that once operated independently began coordinating on a larger scale. Profits were shared, roles were assigned, and everyone had a place in the growing machine. Instead of random acts of violence, punishments became targeted and strategic. Disloyalty wasn't met with public beatings, it was handled quietly, with disappearances or exile. At the same time, younger members were sent abroad to learn the business. Some were based full-time in Spain, helping build connections on the Costa del Sol. Others embedded themselves in Holland or Belgium, overseeing shipments and managing safe houses. These weren't reckless street dealers. They were businessmen in tracksuits, fluent in the codes of both crime and commerce. Europe wasn't just a side operation anymore. It was the heart of the empire, and Liverpool's grip on the continent was only getting tighter. As Liverpool's drug networks expanded into Europe, control back home became more important and more dangerous. The profits pouring in from overseas deals brought power, but they also brought jealousy, greed, and competition. Tensions that had simmered for years between rival gangs began to boil over. What followed was a brutal period of violence that came to be known on the streets as the dock wars. Control of the port routes had become everything, and the cost of losing them was death. The Deli Mob, once dominant in South Liverpool, found itself under pressure. Younger gangs aligned with the Scouse Cartel were moving in, using their connections to Europe to offer better prices and purer product. Old alliances began to fracture. Some Delhi lieutenants jumped ship, while others dug in, determined to hold on to their patch. It didn't take long before the violence exploded. Shootings became a weekly occurrence. One man was gunned down outside a gym. Another was found dead in his car near Sefton Park, 2 bullets to the head, execution style. These weren't random attacks, they were messages. The docks, once the cartel's quiet advantage, became a battleground. Dock workers, some of whom had been paid to turn a blind eye, suddenly found themselves targets. A customs officer who refused a bribe was found drowned in the canal. Another port employee vanished after finishing his night shift. The fear spread quickly. Families moved out of certain areas, and anyone even suspected of cooperating with police was marked. The message was clear: stay silent or suffer the consequences. At the same time, police began noticing a change in the way drugs were moving through the city. Shipments were larger, better hidden, and arriving more frequently. Intelligence suggested that the cartel had taken full control of certain import routes, using a combination of threats, bribes, and logistics to dominate the docks. They were no longer just using Liverpool as a distribution point. They were turning it into a central hub for the UK and Ireland. The violence wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about control of a multi-million-pound pipeline, and those who tried to challenge it were removed quickly, without warning. The streets were quieter during the day, but at night, Liverpool was at war. In 2009, a shipping container flagged for inspection at the port of Colón in Panama revealed something that so did the infrastructure. Safe houses were established in Colombia and Ecuador. Money laundering routes were refined, using cryptocurrency, offshore trusts, and shell companies scattered across the Caribbean. And whenever a courier or broker was arrested, a replacement was already on standby. The network was built to survive. What had started in the alleyways of Liverpool had now reached the jungles of South America. The cartel's fingerprints were on deals happening across 3 continents. And for every container seized, there were 10 more slipping through unnoticed. The empire was no longer hidden. It was simply too big to see. As the Scouse Cartel expanded its reach across continents, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Success brought wealth, power, and influence, but it also brought paranoia, betrayal, and fear. The tight-knit trust that had once held the network together was slowly unraveling. Men who had climbed the ladder together were now watching their backs, unsure who might be feeding information to the authorities, or worse, cutting private deals with rivals. The first disappearance was subtle. A mid-level operator, responsible for overseeing shipments through Spain, stopped answering his phone. His apartment in Marbella was left untouched, his passport still inside. A few weeks later, Another associate was found dead near the border of Belgium and the Netherlands. His body showed signs of torture, a clear message to anyone else thinking of turning informant or acting independently. Back in Liverpool, the fallout was even more chilling. A former Deli Mob lieutenant, who had recently resurfaced with plans to reclaim territory, was abducted in broad daylight. His body was discovered weeks later in a shallow grave outside Chester, hands bound, gunshot wounds to the head. Police believed it was a targeted hit ordered by cartel leadership, an execution disguised as a disappearance. Not all the vanished were dead, some simply fled. A handful of longtime enforcers quietly moved their families abroad, sensing that the walls were closing in. Others went into hiding, afraid of being caught between law enforcement pressure and internal purges. Trust, once the foundation of the cartel's structure, had eroded. The organization had grown too large, too decentralized, and too dangerous. Whispers of betrayal became louder when a major cocaine shipment was intercepted off the coast of Portugal. Only a few people had knowledge of its route. Someone, it seemed, had talked. Retaliation was swift. A known associate of the shipment's logistics team was later found dead in his hotel room in Lisbon. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a clean hit. Internally, the cartel's leadership began to isolate themselves, using layers of intermediaries to communicate and operate. No one spoke directly anymore. Every message was passed through encrypted apps, burner phones, or trusted runners. What once operated like a family now resembled a shadow government, cold, calculating, and willing to erase anyone seen as a threat. By 2015, law enforcement across Europe could no longer ignore the scale of Liverpool's growing drug empire. Years of surveillance, wiretaps, and international cooperation had finally come together under one name: Operation Tidefall. It was the most ambitious investigation ever launched against British organized crime abroad, targeting the heart of the Scouse Cartel and its sprawling network across the UK, Europe, and South America. The operation involved over a dozen agencies, including the National Crime Agency, Europol, and Spanish, Dutch, Belgian police forces. Over 40 coordinated raids were carried out in one day. Armed officers stormed villas in Marbella, seized bank accounts in the Netherlands, and smashed down doors in Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow. In total, over 20 million pounds in assets were frozen, including high-end cars, designer jewelry, gold bars, and entire properties bought in cash through shell companies. In Rotterdam, authorities intercepted a container filled with furniture, inside which were concealed hundreds of kilos of cocaine. In Antwerp, a warehouse used as a stash house was uncovered, its walls lined with cash vacuum-sealed in plastic bricks. The evidence was overwhelming. Operation Tidefall had connected the dots between small Liverpool firms, Spanish real estate agents, corrupt dock workers, and some of the world's most violent cartels. Yet despite the success, something crucial was missing: leadership. The top tier of the Scouse Cartel had vanished. Phones had gone dark days before the raids. Homes were abandoned, bank accounts emptied, and private jets had departed weeks earlier. It became clear that someone inside had tipped them off. The authorities had caught the infrastructure, the middlemen, and the muscle, but the masterminds had slipped through their fingers. In the aftermath, dozens were charged, and many received long sentences. But even behind bars, the business didn't stop. Communication continued through coded messages and outside facilitators. Younger lieutenants stepped up to fill the gaps, adapting quickly to new tactics and tighter security. Operation Tidefall had dealt a serious blow, but it hadn't dismantled the empire. The cartel had simply evolved, scattering its leadership, decentralizing its operations, and reinforcing the code of silence that had kept it alive for decades. What law enforcement had uncovered was massive, but it was only one layer of something much deeper. After Operation Tidefall, the Scouse Cartel faced a new reality, one where trust was scarce, and the line between friend and foe blurred. The arrests and raids had shattered old alliances and created a power vacuum that younger, more ambitious players were eager to fill. These newcomers didn't come from the old guard. Many were from different parts of Liverpool, some even from rival gangs. But they shared one goal: to take the empire to the next level. Unlike their predecessors, the new generation embraced technology and globalization with open arms. Encrypted messaging apps replaced burner phones, cryptocurrencies were used to move money, and dark web marketplaces became platforms for selling drugs and weapons anonymously. This digital shift made their operations harder to trace, and law enforcement found itself chasing shadows in an ever-changing landscape. The new leaders also expanded beyond traditional drugs like heroin and cocaine. Synthetic substances, such as MDM and fentanyl, were introduced to Liverpool's streets. These drugs were cheaper to produce, easier to smuggle, and carried higher profit margins. The cartel's reach extended into nightlife scenes, festivals, and even online sales, tapping into younger demographics across the UK and Europe. However, the rise of this new wave brought increased violence. Competition between emerging factions led to turf wars, more vicious than those of the past. Shootings, stabbings, and public beatings became disturbingly common. But the cartel had learned from past mistakes. It avoided unnecessary exposure. Most hits were quick and quiet, carried out away from crowded areas, leaving communities fearful but often too intimidated to speak out. International ties also grew stronger. Connections were forged with gangs in Eastern Europe, West Africa, and South America, creating a multi-continental network that spanned every corner of the drug trade. Liverpool was no longer just a hub. It had become a command center for one of Europe's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. Despite increased police efforts and public awareness campaigns, the cartel's grip on the city tightened. Money, fear, and loyalty kept the system running. In Liverpool, the story of organized crime wasn't ending. It was evolving, more hidden and more dangerous than ever before. Today, Liverpool's organized crime scene is a complex web of old loyalties, new alliances, and constant adaptation. The city's drug trade is no longer the chaotic street-level dealing of the. Instead, it is a highly organized, multi-layered business, operating across continents, moving millions of pounds worth of drugs every year. The Scouse Syndicates have transformed from local gangs into international networks, with far-reaching influence. The docks remain a crucial gateway, but the methods have become more sophisticated. Containers are scanned with high-tech equipment, forcing traffickers to innovate. Drones, underground tunnels, and even hijacked trucks are used to sneak drugs past border controls. Meanwhile, money laundering has evolved into a high-stakes game involving cryptocurrencies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that serve as cover. The criminal leaders are experts at masking their identities, using layers of intermediaries and complex financial structures to keep themselves hidden from the law. Law enforcement agencies remain locked in a constant battle against these syndicates. Intelligence sharing between countries has improved, and operations like Tidefall have shown that coordinated action can disrupt the networks. Yet, the cartels adapt quickly. When one route closes, another opens. When a key figure is arrested, someone else steps in. It's a game of cat and mouse with high stakes on both sides. But beneath the headlines and court cases lies the human cost. Communities across Liverpool still feel the impact of drug addiction, violence, and poverty fueled by the trade. Families are broken, children grow up surrounded by fear, and opportunities remain scarce in many neighborhoods. The story of the Scouse Syndicates is not just one of crime and power. It's also a story of a city struggling to break free from the cycle. As Liverpool's criminal empires continue to evolve, so too does the challenge facing society. Fighting organized crime is no longer just about arrests and raids. It requires addressing the root causes that allow these syndicates to thrive. Without that, the syndicates will always find new ways to survive, and the hidden drug empire will endure in the shadows, shaping the city's future for years.